The psychology of wealth. There is a quiet question that lives in the minds of millions of people across the world. A question rarely spoken aloud, yet deeply felt in private moments of reflection. Why do some people move through life steadily building financial security, while others work just as hard, sometimes harder, yet remain trapped in a cycle of survival? At first glance, the answer appears obvious. Many assume wealth is simply the result of higher income, better opportunities, superior intelligence, or fortunate timing. From a distance, financial success can look almost mathematical. Earn more, spend less, invest wisely, and prosperity will follow. But real life tells a more complicated story. We have all seen individuals whose salaries grew, yet their stress grew with it. People whose lifestyles expanded faster than their sense of stability. Professionals who appeared successful on the outside, but privately carried the constant weight of financial uncertainty. And on the other side, there are those who earn modestly, live quietly, and over time construct lives of remarkable financial resilience. Not flashy, not loud, but deeply secure. So the question remains, if effort alone is not the divider, if intelligence alone is not the separator, what truly shapes the path toward wealth? The answer is both simpler and more profound than most imagine. Wealth is rarely built first in bank accounts. It is built in behavior. Long before numbers change, patterns form. Long before assets accumulate, habits take root. Long before financial freedom becomes visible, a certain way of thinking begins quietly guiding decisions. Because whether we notice it or not, every financial choice we make, from the smallest purchase to the largest commitment, is influenced by an invisible psychology operating beneath the surface. A psychology shaped by upbringing, by environment, by beliefs absorbed in childhood, by the emotional meanings we attach to money. Some people learn to see money as a tool for construction. Others, without realizing it, experience money as something that must be spent quickly, displayed visibly, or used to keep pace with the expectations of those around them. Neither path is usually chosen consciously. Most of it happens automatically, and that is precisely why understanding the psychology of wealth may be one of the most important forms of education a person can ever receive, yet it is rarely taught in schools, seldom discussed openly, and often discovered only after years of financial frustration. This audiobook is not about quick riches. It is not about chasing trends, timing markets, or finding shortcuts. Instead, it is an invitation to step back, to observe, and to understand the deeper behavioral forces that quietly determine financial outcomes over a lifetime. Because when you begin to see these patterns clearly, something remarkable happens. You stop viewing wealth as a distant privilege reserved for the fortunate few, and start recognizing it as a structure, one that can be patiently built, deliberately strengthened, and thoughtfully protected. But before we explore the behaviors that create wealth, we must first challenge one of the most persistent myths of modern life, the belief that earning more automatically leads to financial freedom. If that were true, financial anxiety would disappear the moment income rises. Yet for many people, the opposite occurs. Responsibilities expand, expectations increase, commitments multiply, and what once felt like progress quietly transforms into a more expensive version of pressure. This reveals an important truth. Financial progress is not determined solely by how much flows into your life, but by what your habits allow to remain. And habits, as you will soon discover, are rarely accidental. They are expressions of identity. Over the course of this audiobook, we will explore why some individuals gradually shift from survival thinking into builder thinking, why patience often outperforms brilliance, why emotional discipline matters more than raw intelligence, and why true wealth is frequently far quieter than the world encourages us to believe. You may recognize parts of your own journey in these ideas. You may begin to notice patterns you had never fully named before. Most importantly, you may come to understand that wherever your financial life stands today, whether stable, uncertain, rebuilding, or just beginning, your future is far less fixed than it might sometimes feel. Because wealth is not a single decision. It is a direction, and direction, at any moment, can be adjusted. So as you listen, allow these ideas to meet you without judgment. There is nothing here you were supposed to have mastered already, no timeline you were required to follow, no race you were meant to win. There is only the opportunity to see more clearly, and from clarity, to move more intentionally. And it is here that our exploration begins. Because long before wealth appears in accounts, it begins in the mind. Chapter 1. Wealth begins in the mind. There is a tendency in modern life to treat wealth as if it were primarily a mathematical outcome, a simple function of income, investment returns, and financial opportunities. From this perspective, the path appears straightforward. Earn more, manage money wisely, and security will eventually follow. Yet when we observe real lives rather than tidy formulas, a different picture emerges. Two individuals can earn similar salaries, live in the same city, face comparable expenses, and still arrive at dramatically different financial futures. One gradually constructs stability, margin, and freedom. The other remains in a continuous state of financial tension, working hard, progressing outwardly, yet somehow never feeling securely ahead. The difference is rarely explained by intelligence alone, nor is it usually the result of luck. More often, the divider is psychological, because long before money settles into accounts, it passes through the filter of the human mind, shaped by beliefs, emotional tendencies, learned behaviors, and invisible internal narratives about what money means and how it should move through one's life. Whether we notice it or not, each of us operates with a kind of internal financial script. Some scripts are empowering, others quietly sabotage progress. And most were written long before we ever earned our first income. For many people, early experiences form lasting impressions. A childhood marked by scarcity may create an adult who feels an almost constant need to spend when money arrives, not out of irresponsibility, but from a deep psychological urge to finally experience relief, comfort, or visible proof of progress. For others, growing up around financial instability can produce the opposite response: extreme caution, reluctance to invest, and an enduring fear of loss, even when opportunities are reasonable. Neither reaction is irrational. Both are human. But without awareness, these inherited patterns often continue running silently in the background, shaping decisions decade after decade. Consider how rarely people pause to ask themselves a simple question: what do I actually believe about money? Is it something to be enjoyed immediately? Something that disappears quickly? Something difficult to hold on to? Something reserved for others? Or is it viewed as a tool, neutral, patient, and capable of being directed with intention? These beliefs matter more than most realize, because behavior almost always follows identity. A person who subconsciously sees themselves as bad with money will often act in ways that confirm that identity, sometimes without recognizing the pattern until years have passed. Meanwhile, someone who begins to view themselves as a builder tends to make decisions aligned with construction rather than consumption. This is why wealth rarely begins with a dramatic financial breakthrough. It begins with a quieter shift, a change in how one sees themselves in relation to money, not as a temporary holder of income, but as a deliberate architect of financial life. And architecture by its nature favors patience over urgency. One of the most revealing observations in financial behavior is that people do not usually rise to the level of their goals. They fall to the level of their habits. A person may sincerely desire stability, freedom, even long-term prosperity, but if their daily financial behaviors remain unexamined, intention alone cannot carry them forward. Habits, repeated consistently, are what ultimately shape outcomes. Small decisions accumulate quietly. An impulse purchase here, an avoided savings decision there, a postponed investment, an unnoticed subscription. Individually, these moments appear harmless. Collectively, they chart a financial direction. This is both the danger and the promise of behavioral patterns. They operate gradually enough that we rarely feel their full weight until much later. Yet the same principle works beautifully in the opposite direction. When constructive habits take root, however modest they may seem, they begin forming a foundation strong enough to support future opportunity. Over time, discipline reduces friction, margin appears, choices expand, and what once felt financially distant begins to feel increasingly attainable. But this raises an important question. If habits are so powerful, why do so many intelligent people struggle to maintain them? The answer lies not in a lack of knowledge. Most adults already understand the basics of sound financial behavior. Spend thoughtfully, save consistently, avoid unnecessary debt, invest with patience. The challenge is rarely informational, It is emotional. Because money is never purely numerical. It is deeply psychological. It touches status, security, identity, belonging, even self-worth. When friends upgrade their lifestyles, restraint can feel like falling behind. When work feels exhausting, spending can masquerade as reward. When the future feels uncertain, planning for it may seem strangely abstract compared to the tangible pleasures of the present. In moments like these, the emotional brain speaks loudly, and unless guided by conscious awareness, it often overrides long-term reasoning. This is why financial maturity is less about mastering complex strategies and more about learning to pause between impulse and action. That pause, brief as it may be, is where intentional living begins. It is the space in which a person quietly asks, "Does this decision move me toward the life I want, or merely toward the comfort of this moment?" No one answers this perfectly every time, nor is perfection required. Wealth is not built by flawless behavior. It is built by consistent direction, a gradual leaning toward choices that support future stability rather than undermine it. Importantly, this shift does not demand dramatic deprivation. Contrary to popular imagination, financially thoughtful individuals are not necessarily joyless or rigid. Instead, they tend to develop a clear distinction between fleeting satisfaction and lasting value. They spend, but with awareness. They enjoy, but without losing proportion. They plan, but without becoming consumed by fear. Balance, rather than extremity, becomes their quiet advantage. And perhaps most reassuring of all is this: at any stage of life, a person can begin revising their financial script. Past decisions, while instructive, are not life sentences. Patterns can be interrupted. Habits can be redesigned. Direction can change, sometimes far more quickly than one expects, once awareness enters the picture. Because the moment you begin observing your own behavior with curiosity rather than judgment, you step into authorship. No longer merely reacting to financial currents, but learning to steer. As we move forward, you will notice that wealth is rarely the product of one grand decision. More often, it emerges from dozens of subtle behavioral shifts, each one small enough to seem ordinary, yet powerful enough to alter the trajectory of a lifetime. But before those shifts can fully take hold, we must examine one of the most common psychological states that quietly prevents people from building lasting security, regardless of how much they earn. It is a mindset that compresses time, narrows possibility, and keeps attention locked firmly on the immediate horizon. A state many hard-working individuals know far too well: the survival trap. And it is there that our exploration now turns. Chapter 2: The Survival Trap. There is a financial state that rarely announces itself loudly, yet shapes the daily decisions of millions of hard-working people across the world. It is not always visible from the outside. In fact, someone can appear professionally stable, responsible, even successful, and still live within it. This state is known as survival thinking. Survival thinking is not defined by income level. It is defined by time horizon. When a person is operating in survival mode, attention narrows toward what is immediately pressing: this month's obligations, the next payment, the unexpected expense, the near-term responsibility. Financial life becomes intensely present-focused, not because the person lacks intelligence or ambition, but because the brain, when exposed to repeated pressure, naturally prioritizes what feels urgent over what appears distant. This response is deeply human. Our nervous systems are designed to protect us from immediate threats, not to calmly strategize decades into the future. And so, when financial pressure becomes familiar, even subtly, the mind adapts by concentrating on short-range stability. Planning becomes secondary. Vision contracts. Long-term construction begins to feel like a luxury reserved for calmer seasons of life. Yet here lies the quiet paradox. For many people, that calmer season never seems to arrive, not because they are careless, but because survival thinking, once normalized, can become self-reinforcing. Consider what happens psychologically when most resources are directed toward maintaining the present. Savings feel difficult because available margin appears thin. Investing feels risky because loss seems less tolerable. Opportunities feel easier to postpone because certainty carries emotional weight. And slowly, without any dramatic mistake, the future receives less attention than it quietly requires. It is important to understand that survival thinking is not a sign of failure. Often, it is evidence of responsibility. People supporting families, honoring commitments, navigating demanding environments, adapting to rising costs, building lives far from where they began. These are not markers of weakness. They are signs of endurance. But endurance alone, while admirable, does not automatically create expansion. Without intentional interruption, survival mode can stretch across years, even decades, keeping capable individuals working tirelessly without ever feeling securely ahead. One of the most overlooked characteristics of survival thinking is how it alters perception. When the mind is heavily focused on immediate needs, long-term opportunities can begin to look abstract, even unrealistic. A person may tell themselves, "I will plan seriously once things settle. I will invest when I earn a little more. I will think long-term after this demanding season passes." These statements feel reasonable, yet many financial lives are quietly delayed inside them, because later, while comforting to imagine, has a subtle tendency to remain just beyond reach unless deliberately claimed. Another effect of prolonged survival focus is decision compression. Choices become filtered primarily through one question: what solves the present tension? This is understandable, but it can gradually crowd out a more powerful question: what builds the future? Builders learn to hold both questions at once, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the future remains under quiet construction even while the present is responsibly managed. It is also worth noting that survival is not always tied to low earnings. Some individuals experience what might be called high-income survival, where rising salaries are quickly absorbed by expanding lifestyles, larger commitments, and elevated expectations. From the outside, progress appears obvious. Yet internally, the sensation of financial breathing room remains surprisingly elusive. This reveals an essential truth. Survival is less about how much enters your life, and more about how much remains available to support tomorrow. Margin is what transforms effort into stability. Without margin, even strong incomes can feel fragile. With margin, even moderate earnings can begin to generate quiet confidence. So how does one begin stepping out of survival thinking? Not through sudden dramatic change, rarely through financial windfalls, but through something far more accessible: a gradual expansion of time perspective. Builders train themselves, gently but deliberately, to look further ahead. They begin asking questions that survival mode tends to silence. What would my life feel like 5 years from now if I started preparing today? What small decision could create future relief? Where might consistency serve me more than intensity? Notice the emphasis on smallness. Leaving survival is not about executing a perfect plan overnight. It is about reclaiming authorship of direction, one thoughtful adjustment at a time. Perhaps the most encouraging reality is this: a person does not need to escape pressure completely before beginning to build. In fact, many strong financial lives are constructed by individuals who learn to balance both, responsibly meeting present obligations while quietly strengthening the ground beneath their future. Construction and responsibility are not opposing forces. They can coexist, but this coexistence requires awareness. Because once you recognize the pull of survival thinking, you gain the ability to gently resist its narrowing effect. You begin allowing the future a seat at the decision-making table, not dominating the present, but no longer absent from it. And over time, this expanded horizon changes something profound. Urgency softens, options widen, decisions feel less reactive and more intentional. What once felt like constant maintenance begins, gradually, to feel like progress. As we continue, you will notice that many financially steady individuals share a trait that is easily misunderstood in a culture fascinated by visibility. Their progress is rarely dramatic. Their lives are seldom performative. Their wealth, more often than not, develops quietly. Which brings us to a surprising realization, one that challenges many modern assumptions about success. Real wealth is often far less visible than we are taught to expect, and understanding this may free you from one of the most expensive psychological pressures of all. Chapter 3. Wealth is quiet. Modern culture has made visibility dangerously easy. At almost any moment, we can witness fragments of other people's lives: upgraded homes, celebratory purchases, carefully framed milestones, symbols of apparent arrival. Over time, this steady exposure can shape a powerful but rarely questioned assumption that wealth, when it exists, must be obvious, must be displayed, must be seen. Yet when we step back from appearances and observe financial life more carefully, a very different pattern reveals itself. Many of the most financially stable individuals do not look extraordinary at all. Their lives may appear comfortable but measured, successful but not theatrical, secure without drawing attention. And because their progress is understated, it is often overlooked. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of wealth. What is most visible is not always what is most secure, and what is most secure is often not especially visible. There are several reasons for this. First, true financial construction tends to prioritize durability over impression. Resources are directed toward assets, resilience, and long-term positioning rather than toward constant outward signaling. Second, financially thoughtful individuals often develop a subtle comfort with privacy. They understand that not every milestone requires an audience, and that progress, when protected from unnecessary scrutiny, has more space to compound. But perhaps most importantly, they free themselves from a psychological race that quietly drains countless others, the race to appear ahead. It is worth pausing here to recognize how powerful this pressure can be. Human beings are social observers by nature. We measure, compare, and locate ourselves within the visible landscape around us, often without realizing how frequently this comparison is taking place. When peers seem to accelerate, when lifestyles appear to expand, when success looks increasingly immediate, restraint can begin to feel like falling behind. Patience can feel indistinguishable from stagnation, and disciplined choices, though wise, can momentarily feel isolating. Yet what comparison rarely reveals is the structure beneath the surface. Two lives may look similar externally, while resting on entirely different foundations, one supported by growing assets and manageable obligations, the other sustained by fragile leverage and continuous financial strain. From a distance, both may signal success. Up close, only one offers lasting ease. This is why builders gradually train their attention away from external tempo. Instead of asking, "How do I look relative to others?" they begin asking a quieter, far more stabilizing question: is my life becoming structurally stronger? Strength is less glamorous than speed, but it is infinitely more protective. Another characteristic of quiet wealth is emotional neutrality toward status signals. This does not mean financially grounded individuals reject enjoyment or comfort. Rather, they tend to pause long enough to distinguish between what enriches their life and what merely broadcasts it. Over time, this pause becomes liberating, because once you no longer feel compelled to perform progress, you reclaim enormous decision-making freedom. You can upgrade thoughtfully instead of reflexively, choose timing deliberately instead of reactively, and perhaps most importantly, allow your financial life to unfold at a pace aligned with durability rather than spectacle. There is also a profound psychological calm that accompanies this shift. When your choices are no longer organized around observation from others, mental noise begins to soften. Financial decisions feel less charged, comparison loses urgency, and the future starts to feel less like a race and more like a landscape you are steadily shaping. It is important, however, not to confuse quiet wealth with small living. The distinction is subtle but significant. Quiet wealth is not about shrinking your life. It is about strengthening it. It is about ensuring that what you build can support you, not just impress others briefly. In fact, many financially secure individuals expand their lives generously, but they tend to do so from a position of stability rather than strain. Their upgrades rest on foundations already prepared to carry the weight. This difference, invisible to most observers, is what allows enjoyment without anxiety, because the opposite of quiet wealth is not loud wealth. It is fragile wealth. Fragility is what forces constant maintenance. It is what turns minor disruptions into major stress. It is what keeps attention tethered to the fear that the structure may not hold. Durability, by contrast, creates something invaluable: financial breathing room. Breathing room changes how a person moves through the world. Decisions become less hurried. Risks can be evaluated with greater clarity. Unexpected events, while never welcome, feel less destabilizing. And beneath it all emerges a quiet but unmistakable confidence. Not the confidence of display, but the confidence of preparedness. Of course, choosing this path requires a certain form of courage, the courage to progress without applause, the courage to resist cultural urgency, the courage to trust that what compounds slowly often endures longest. Fortunately, patience is not a fixed trait granted to a lucky few. It is a capacity that strengthens each time we act in alignment with a longer horizon, which leads us naturally to one of the most underestimated forces in financial life, a force so powerful that when understood, it can transform modest beginnings into remarkable outcomes. Yet paradoxically, it is often abandoned precisely because its early stages feel almost invisible. Patience. Let us explore why patience is not merely a virtue in wealth building, but a structural advantage. Chapter 4. The Patience Advantage. In a world that celebrates acceleration, patience can easily be mistaken for passivity. We are surrounded by stories of rapid ascent, sudden success, fast fortunes, dramatic breakthroughs. Progress, as it is often portrayed, appears swift and unmistakable. And so, when our own financial lives unfold gradually, it can be tempting to wonder whether we are moving too slowly, whether we are missing opportunities, whether others have discovered a path we somehow overlooked. Yet beneath the noise of these narratives lies a quieter reality. Most enduring wealth is not created quickly. It is compounded. Compounding is frequently described in mathematical terms: growth upon growth, returns generating further returns. But before it is ever numerical, compounding is behavioral. It begins with the willingness to continue steadily, often invisibly, while results are still too small to attract attention. This early phase tests something deeper than knowledge. It tests emotional endurance, because one of the greatest psychological challenges in long-term building is that the initial rewards rarely feel proportional to the effort required. Contributions appear modest. Progress seems incremental. At times, the distance between where you are and where you hope to be can feel wide enough to invite discouragement. Many people turn away during this stage, not due to incapability, but due to impatience. They interpret slow beginnings as evidence that their actions are insufficient, when in truth they may simply be witnessing the natural tempo of durable growth. Consider how different this is from the rhythms we are conditioned to expect. Modern systems train us to anticipate responsiveness, messages answered instantly, purchases delivered rapidly, entertainment available on demand. Waiting increasingly feels like friction. Yet wealth operates on a very different clock. It rewards continuity far more than intensity. A brief surge of disciplined behavior, however admirable, cannot substitute for years of thoughtful consistency. Just as a structure is strengthened by the steady placement of each supporting element, financial resilience emerges through repeated, measured action. Over time, something subtle but extraordinary begins to occur. Momentum forms. What once required deliberate effort starts to feel increasingly automatic. Contributions accumulate upon one another. Decisions grow clearer. The future, once abstract, begins to take on a reassuring solidity. And then comes the phase that many who abandon the process never reach, the phase where growth itself begins to assist you. It is often said that compounding appears slow until suddenly it does not. But suddenly, in this context, is rarely sudden at all. It is simply the visible arrival of a process long underway. Understanding this protects you from one of the costliest financial impulses, the urge to chase speed. Speed can be seductive. Opportunities promising rapid gain often carry an emotional charge, a sense of urgency that suggests delay might mean missing out. Yet what is rarely emphasized is that speed frequently travels alongside fragility. When outcomes depend on perfect timing, uninterrupted conditions, or elevated risk, stability becomes difficult to maintain. Patience, by contrast, aligns itself with durability. It allows room for adjustment. It accommodates learning. It acknowledges that missteps are not endpoints but information, part of the gradual refinement that accompanies any meaningful construction. Importantly, patience does not mean inactivity. It is not the absence of ambition, nor the surrender of aspiration. Rather, it is disciplined persistence guided by a long horizon. A patient builder is often quite active, saving, investing, learning, recalibrating, but does so without the emotional turbulence that accompanies constant urgency. There is also a profound psychological freedom embedded within patience. When you release the expectation that progress must look dramatic in the present, you liberate yourself to focus on what is structurally sound rather than what is immediately impressive. You stop asking, "Does this make me look successful today?" and begin asking, "Will this strengthen my life tomorrow?" That single shift reorganizes countless decisions. It becomes easier to maintain commitments that once felt restrictive, easier to ignore distractions that once felt tempting, easier to allow time to become an ally rather than an adversary. Another often overlooked benefit of patience is the clarity it brings to risk. When you are oriented toward the long term, you no longer need every decision to produce immediate transformation. This reduces the emotional appeal of speculative paths and encourages steadier, more intelligible strategies. You begin to understand that wealth is less about dramatic leaps and more about staying on the path long enough for distance to accumulate behind you. Of course, patience does not suggest that every season will feel comfortable. Markets fluctuate, economies shift, personal circumstances evolve. There will be periods when progress appears to pause, moments when uncertainty invites second-guessing. Yet those who remain anchored to a broader timeline often discover that temporary turbulence does not define the trajectory. Time, when partnered with consistent behavior, has a remarkable capacity to smooth volatility. Perhaps the most reassuring realization is this: you do not need extraordinary beginnings to benefit from patience. You need only a willingness to continue. Small, repeated actions, almost unremarkable in isolation, possess an underestimated power when allowed to accumulate uninterrupted. A modest contribution maintained for years can surpass sporadic intensity. Measured growth can outperform erratic expansion, and a calm strategy can outlast bursts of emotional decision-making. In this way, patience becomes more than a personality trait. It becomes a structural advantage. Yet even as patience strengthens the architecture of wealth, there exists another force, far quieter, yet surprisingly pervasive, that can gradually erode progress without announcing its presence. It does not arrive as a dramatic mistake. More often, it appears disguised as reward, as progress, even as success itself. Left unexamined, it can absorb rising income almost as quickly as it appears, keeping financial freedom perpetually just beyond reach. This force is known as lifestyle inflation, and understanding it may protect you from one of the most common reasons people work harder each year, yet feel no closer to lasting ease. Chapter 5. Lifestyle Inflation, the Invisible Enemy. Financial setbacks are often imagined as dramatic events: failed investments, unexpected crises, major miscalculations. And while such moments can certainly alter a financial path, many lives are shaped far more quietly by something less obvious. Not a collapse, not a mistake, but a gradual expansion. Lifestyle inflation rarely announces itself as a threat. In fact, it often arrives wearing the reassuring language of progress. A salary increases, a promotion is earned, a new opportunity appears. Naturally, there is a desire to let life reflect this forward movement, perhaps a more comfortable home, greater convenience, upgraded experiences, small luxuries that once felt distant. None of these desires are inherently problematic. Growth is meant to be felt. Effort deserves to translate into lived improvement. Yet the difficulty arises when each increase in income is swiftly matched or exceeded by an increase in obligation. What begins as expansion can quietly become absorption, and when nearly every financial gain is pre-committed to sustaining a higher baseline, something essential begins to disappear: margin. Margin is more than leftover money. It is psychological space. It is what allows a person to meet the unexpected without immediate distress, to consider opportunities without scrambling, to make decisions from intention rather than urgency. Without margin, even rising earners can find themselves inhabiting a strangely fragile position, outwardly advancing, yet internally aware that their structure requires continuous support. This is why lifestyle inflation is often called invisible. There is rarely a single moment when one feels they have crossed a boundary. Adjustments happen incrementally: a slightly higher payment here, a recurring expense there, each one reasonable in isolation. But over time, the cumulative effect can be profound. Consider how easily new comforts become familiar and then expected, What once felt like a welcome upgrade soon recedes into normalcy, no longer experienced as a privilege but as the standard against which daily life is measured. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as adaptation, our remarkable ability to grow accustomed to improved circumstances. While this capacity allows humans to remain resilient across changing environments, it also carries a subtle financial implication. Satisfaction tends to stabilize, even as costs continue. And so the horizon moves. The level that once symbolized enough quietly shifts forward, replaced by a new threshold that appears equally necessary. Left unexamined, this cycle can continue indefinitely, each season of effort funding the next layer of expectation, yet rarely delivering the enduring sense of arrival people imagined. It is important to emphasize that lifestyle inflation is not driven by recklessness alone. Often, it is reinforced by powerful social currents. When peers upgrade, restraint can feel conspicuous. When certain comforts become culturally normalized, opting out may feel like deprivation rather than choice. When success is frequently measured through visible markers, moderation can be misinterpreted, even by ourselves, as stagnation. Yet financially grounded individuals tend to approach expansion differently. Rather than allowing every raise to reorganize their cost structure, they introduce a deliberate pause, a moment of evaluation between increased earning and increased spending. They ask quietly, will this addition strengthen my life or merely enlarge it? Strengthening might mean directing a portion of new income toward future security, reducing financial vulnerability, or creating options that did not previously exist. Enlarging, by contrast, often focuses on immediate enhancement, pleasant, sometimes meaningful, but not always protective. There is nothing inherently wrong with enlargement. The difficulty arises when enlargement consumes everything. When progress improves appearance, but not resilience. When effort produces motion without producing stability. Over time, a disciplined imbalance becomes one of the most reliable defenses against lifestyle inflation, allowing a share of each financial advance to flow toward long-term construction before daily living expands to meet it. This does not require austerity, nor does it demand the rejection of enjoyment. Instead, it reflects an understanding that the future deserves participation in the rewards of the present. Another helpful perspective is to view fixed expenses with particular care. While discretionary spending can often be adjusted, fixed commitments tend to anchor future cash flow. Each new obligation, however manageable today, represents a promise your future self must continue keeping. Financially thoughtful individuals treat such promises with respect, not fearfully, but deliberately, recognizing that flexibility is one of the quiet pillars of lasting security. Perhaps the most liberating realization is this: you are allowed to grow your lifestyle, just not faster than you grow your foundation. When foundation leads, enjoyment feels supported rather than strained. When expansion outruns structure, even beautiful upgrades can carry an undercurrent of pressure. There is also a deeper psychological reward awaiting those who learn to moderate this expansion. Instead of requiring every external condition to remain favorable, they begin to sense that their stability travels with them, not dependent on maintaining a particular image, but rooted in choices already made. That sensation is difficult to overstate. It replaces a subtle vigilance with something far calmer: confidence. Not the loud confidence of display, but the quiet confidence of knowing that your life is becoming increasingly difficult to destabilize. And yet, behind every consistent financial behavior lies something even more foundational, a force shaping decisions long before they become visible in accounts or lifestyles. It is not income. It is not opportunity. It is identity. For whether we recognize it or not, people tend to build lives that reflect the person they believe themselves to be. Let us turn there next to the hidden engine quietly directing financial behavior. Chapter 6. Identity, the hidden financial engine. Long before a financial decision is made, long before money is saved, invested, or spent, something quieter is already at work: identity. Identity is the internal story a person carries about who they are, often unspoken, frequently unquestioned, yet profoundly influential. It shapes behavior not through force, but through alignment. People tend to act in ways that feel consistent with their self-image, even when those actions contradict their stated goals. This is why two individuals with similar knowledge can behave so differently. One understands the value of saving and saves naturally. Another understands the same principle, yet postpones it repeatedly. The difference is rarely intellectual. It is often identity-based. If a person somewhere beneath conscious thought sees themselves as someone who is never quite good with money, their behavior will often confirm that narrative, not deliberately and not out of resignation, but because human beings are deeply motivated to remain coherent with the version of themselves they believe to be true. In this way, identity becomes a quiet financial engine, directing patterns, sustaining habits, and influencing reactions long before logic enters the conversation. Many financial identities are formed early, sometimes through observation, sometimes through experience. A household where money was a constant source of tension may produce an adult who avoids looking closely at finances, preferring emotional distance over discomfort. Another environment might instill the belief that money is meant to be enjoyed quickly, that holding on to it invites loss, or that visible success is the clearest proof of progress. Others may internalize a subtler script, that wealth belongs to people who are somehow different, more fortunate, more connected, more inherently suited to financial success. These narratives, once absorbed, rarely announce themselves. Instead, they operate quietly in the background, shaping decisions in ways that feel almost automatic. Yet here is the encouraging reality. Identity is not fixed. It is constructed and therefore can be reconstructed. Financially grounded individuals often undergo a subtle but decisive shift at some point in their lives. Rather than seeing themselves as temporary recipients of income, they begin to view themselves as architects of their financial future. This shift is rarely dramatic. There is no ceremony marking its arrival. Often it begins with a simple recognition: my choices are not random. They are votes for the kind of life I am building. Each thoughtful decision becomes evidence supporting a new self-concept, not perfection evidence. Saving a modest amount becomes more than a transaction. It becomes proof of being someone who prepares. Declining an unnecessary expense becomes proof of being someone who prioritizes stability. Investing patiently becomes proof of being someone oriented toward the long horizon. Over time, these proofs accumulate, strengthening the internal narrative until disciplined behavior no longer feels like effort. It feels like congruence. This is one of the quiet secrets behind consistent financial lives. When behavior aligns with identity, friction decreases. Actions that once required willpower begin to feel natural. Of course, identity change does not demand severity. One need not become rigid or ascetic to adopt the posture of a builder. In fact, sustainable identities tend to allow room for enjoyment, flexibility, and humanity. The goal is not to eliminate pleasure. It is to ensure that pleasure does not quietly erode protection. A helpful question sometimes emerges during this transition. Is this decision consistent with the person I am becoming? Notice the orientation toward becoming rather than being. Identity is less a declaration than a direction, less about claiming perfection and more about choosing trajectory. Importantly, no past decision disqualifies a person from this shift. Financial histories, whether smooth or turbulent, are records of where one has been, not verdicts on where one must remain. The moment awareness enters, authorship begins. Another powerful aspect of identity is its influence during moments of emotional pressure. When markets fluctuate, when uncertainty rises, when others appear to move faster, identity acts as an anchor. Someone who sees themselves as a speculator may feel pulled toward reaction. Someone who sees themselves as a builder is more likely to remain guided by structure, not immune to emotion, but steadied by self-understanding. In this way, identity quietly protects the future. It reduces the need for constant decision-making because many choices have already been pre-aligned with the kind of life one intends to construct. And perhaps most reassuring of all is that identity strengthens through repetition, not intensity. You do not need sweeping financial gestures to become a builder. You need only consistent signals, small acts that reaffirm the direction you have chosen. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, a new internal sentence begins to form. I am someone who builds. Once that sentence feels true, behavior tends to follow. Yet even with a grounded identity, another force remains capable of disrupting financial progress: a force less visible than knowledge, yet more decisive than intelligence: emotion. For money, despite its numerical appearance, is rarely handled in purely rational space. It travels through hope, fear, comparison, anticipation, and sometimes quiet anxiety about what the future may hold. Understanding this emotional landscape may be one of the most protective skills a person can develop, because while intelligence can guide strategy, emotional discipline sustains it. Chapter 7: Emotional Discipline, the Guardian of Wealth. Money is often presented as a domain of calculation, percentages, projections, strategies, forecasts. From the outside, it appears orderly, even logical. Yet anyone who has navigated financial decisions over time knows a quieter truth. Money flows through emotion before it ever moves through mathematics. Hope can accelerate it. Fear can freeze it. Excitement can scatter it. Comparison can distort it. And without awareness, these emotional currents can redirect even the most carefully designed plans. This is why financial success is rarely determined by intelligence alone. Many highly capable individuals understand exactly what they should do: save consistently, invest patiently, avoid unnecessary risk, yet find themselves pulled off course in moments charged with feeling. The challenge is not knowledge, it is steadiness. Emotional discipline is the capacity to remain guided by long-term intention, even when short-term feelings grow loud. Not the absence of emotion, for that would be neither realistic nor desirable, but the ability to prevent temporary states from dictating permanent consequences. Consider how naturally fear arises during periods of uncertainty. Markets fluctuate, headlines sharpen, conversations fill with caution. In such moments, the instinct to retreat can feel overwhelmingly protective. Yet history repeatedly shows that reacting from fear often transforms temporary declines into lasting losses. The disciplined individual does not ignore fear. Instead, they acknowledge it, allow it to inform awareness, but refrain from granting it full authority over decision-making. There is a quiet strength in that pause. Equally influential is the emotion of excitement, particularly when opportunity appears abundant. Stories of rapid gains circulate. Others seem to move swiftly. Momentum feels contagious. Excitement, when unchecked, can blur the boundary between thoughtful risk and impulsive action. The desire to participate, to avoid being left behind, to capture what appears to be a fleeting window. These sensations are deeply human, yet disciplined builders learn to ask a stabilizing question. Am I acting from clarity or from emotional urgency? That single inquiry has preserved countless financial futures. Another powerful emotional undercurrent is comparison. Few forces alter perception as quickly as the sense that others are advancing faster. When peers celebrate milestones, upgrade lifestyles, or speak of opportunities seized, it can quietly recalibrate our own expectations. Comparison has a way of compressing timelines, making steady progress feel insufficient simply because it is not immediate. But financial lives are not synchronized performances. Each unfolds within its own context, shaped by starting points, responsibilities, choices, and chance. Emotional discipline allows a person to honor their own trajectory without becoming destabilized by the visible tempo of others. Perhaps the most underestimated emotional skill in wealth building is boredom tolerance. Much of durable financial behavior is, in truth, quite unremarkable day to day. Contributing regularly, maintaining structure, avoiding unnecessary disruption, allowing time to perform its patient work. There are few dramatic moments in this process, and that is precisely its strength. Yet for many, the absence of excitement can invite restlessness. The mind begins to search for stimulation, for acceleration, for something that feels more dynamic than steady continuation. Ironically, it is often this search that introduces unnecessary risk. Disciplined individuals gradually make peace with the understated rhythm of long-term construction. They come to understand that what feels uneventful in the present is often what makes the future resilient. Another dimension of emotional discipline is the ability to separate self-worth from financial fluctuation. Gains do not confer superiority. Setbacks do not imply inadequacy. Both are part of a landscape that no participant controls completely. When identity remains anchored beyond temporary outcomes, decisions regain clarity. One is less tempted to overextend during favorable periods, less inclined to abandon structure during challenging ones. In this way, emotional steadiness becomes a form of protection, not shielding a person from volatility, but preventing volatility from dictating their behavior. It is also worth remembering that emotional discipline strengthens through practice, not perfection. No one navigates every financial moment flawlessly. Even experienced builders encounter doubt, hesitation, second thoughts. What distinguishes them is not emotional silence, but emotional recovery, the ability to return to structure after the noise subsides. Over time, this reliability compounds into something quietly powerful: trust in one's own decision-making. And trust, once established internally, reduces the impulse to react externally. As emotional discipline takes root, financial life begins to feel less like a sequence of pressured responses and more like a guided progression. The future no longer appears as something to brace against, but as something gradually being prepared for. Yet while inner steadiness is essential, no financial life unfolds in isolation. Each of us moves within environments, social, cultural, professional, that subtly influence what feels normal, what feels desirable, and even what feels possible. Understanding the environment around you may reveal forces shaping your financial behavior that you have rarely paused to examine. For environment, though often invisible, can either support the architecture of wealth or quietly strain it. Chapter 8: The Environment Effect. How Surroundings Shape Financial Destiny. There is a comforting idea many people carry: the belief that financial decisions are made independently, guided purely by personal preference and rational thought. Yet human beings are deeply adaptive. We absorb cues from our surroundings continuously, often without conscious notice. What we see regularly begins to feel normal. What feels normal begins to feel acceptable, and what feels acceptable quietly influences our choices. In this way, environment becomes one of the most powerful and least discussed architects of financial behavior. Consider how effortlessly expectations are calibrated by proximity. When certain lifestyles dominate our field of vision, they gradually redefine what appears standard. Expenses that once seemed extravagant can begin to feel ordinary. Commitments that might have prompted hesitation can start to look inevitable. No formal persuasion is required. Exposure alone is persuasive. This is not a flaw in human design. It is a survival mechanism. Across history, adapting to one's environment increased belonging and reduced friction within groups. But in modern financial life, unconscious adaptation can sometimes pull individuals toward patterns that strain rather than strengthen their future. One subtle influence is the normalization of debt. In many settings, borrowing is so commonplace that its long-term weight fades from immediate perception. Payments blend into routine. Obligations stretch across years so quietly that they are rarely questioned once accepted. Yet every obligation represents future effort already assigned, time not yet lived, income not yet earned, already spoken for. Financially grounded individuals do not necessarily reject borrowing outright. Instead, they tend to approach it with heightened awareness, recognizing that flexibility is among the most valuable forms of stability a person can possess. Another environmental force is the culture of consumption, the gentle but persistent suggestion that life is best experienced through continual upgrading. Newer, larger, faster, more refined. While innovation undoubtedly improves many aspects of living, the pace of encouraged replacement can blur the distinction between enhancement and excess. When replacement becomes reflexive rather than intentional, financial life accelerates without necessarily deepening. It is worth asking, from time to time, is this choice improving the quality of my life, or simply refreshing its appearance? There is also the influence of conversation. The topics that circulate within our social circles subtly define what feels worthy of attention. In some environments, discussions revolve around opportunity, growth, and long-term positioning. In others, the emphasis may lean toward immediate enjoyment or visible markers of arrival. Neither orientation is inherently wrong, but one tends to construct the future more reliably than the other. Financially thoughtful individuals often become intentional about informational environment as well. The books they engage with, the ideas they revisit, the voices they allow to inform their perspective. Over time, these inputs accumulate, quietly expanding what they perceive as possible. Perhaps the most delicate environmental pressure is comparison, not the dramatic variety, but the steady background awareness of how others appear to be living. Comparison can compress patience, distort satisfaction, and invite decisions made less from desire than from the wish to remain socially aligned. Yet lives are not synchronized journeys. Each carries its own responsibilities, aspirations, starting points, and unseen complexities. When decisions begin serving comparison rather than construction, the future can become inadvertently tethered to standards never consciously chosen. Intentional distance can sometimes be protective, not withdrawal, but discernment. The recognition that not every norm deserves automatic adoption. This does not require dramatic change in one's relationships or surroundings. Often it begins with awareness, the quiet understanding that you are permitted to choose which influences to internalize and which to observe without imitation. Environment, after all, is not solely external. It can be curated. Small adjustments accumulate, seeking perspectives that emphasize durability, spending time with those who respect restraint, engaging ideas that stretch the horizon beyond immediate gratification. Gradually, the atmosphere around decision-making shifts, and within a supportive atmosphere, disciplined behavior requires less resistance. It is important, however, to remember that no environment is perfectly aligned with long-term construction. At times, you will encounter currents pulling toward immediacy, urging acceleration, or equating visibility with success. In such moments, awareness becomes your quiet anchor. You begin to recognize that while you cannot control every influence around you, you retain authorship over the direction you follow. Over time, this authorship fosters a subtle but powerful confidence, the sense that your financial life is guided not merely by proximity, but by intention. As environment becomes more consciously navigated, another distinction begins to clarify, one that separates those who gradually expand their options from those who remain caught in cycles of reaction. It is not intelligence, nor luck. It is their relationship with time. Some individuals organize decisions primarily around the present moment, responding, adjusting, managing what is immediately before them. Others orient their lives toward a more distant horizon, allowing future implications to gently inform present action. Both are living in the same world, but they are moving through time very differently. Chapter 9. Long-term thinkers versus short-term reactors. Every financial decision, whether small or significant, is quietly shaped by one underlying question: over what span of time am I thinking? Though rarely spoken aloud, this question divides financial lives more decisively than income, education, or even opportunity. Some individuals move through the world responding primarily to what is immediately visible: the current demand, the present desire, the urgent obligation, the opportunity that appears too near to ignore. Others organize their decisions against a broader horizon, allowing future implications to gently influence present action. Neither orientation is inherently flawed. Responsiveness is often necessary. Life requires adaptation. Yet when reaction becomes the dominant pattern, the future can gradually narrow without ever being consciously surrendered. Short-term reactivity often feels practical in the moment. After all, immediate concerns are tangible. They ask for attention now, not years from now. And the human brain, finely tuned for survival, naturally prioritizes what feels closest. But when most decisions serve only the present, something subtle occurs. The future receives whatever remains, if anything remains at all. Long-term thinkers approach time differently. They do not ignore the present, rather they position it within a larger continuum. Today becomes not merely something to manage, but something to align. They ask questions that extend beyond the immediate. If I repeat this behavior for the next decade, where might it lead? Will this obligation expand my options, or quietly limit them? Am I solving only for comfort today, or also for stability tomorrow? These questions rarely produce dramatic answers. More often they guide modest adjustments, small realignments that accumulate direction over years. One of the distinguishing traits of long-term thinkers is their relationship with sacrifice. Contrary to popular imagination, they do not necessarily experience their choices as deprivation. Instead, they perceive them as exchanges, trading a portion of immediate ease for expanded future autonomy. Autonomy is a powerful word in financial life. It represents the ability to choose rather than comply, to respond rather than react, to shape one's days with greater intentionality. Seen through this lens, many short-term temptations lose some of their urgency. The question shifts from, "Can I afford this now?" to something deeper, "How might this decision shape the range of my future choices?" Another hallmark of long-term orientation is tolerance for delayed visibility. Builders grow comfortable progressing without constant external confirmation. They understand that some of the most important forms of advancement, reduced vulnerability, increasing margin, strengthening foundations, are not immediately apparent. There is a quiet confidence in this invisibility. It frees a person from needing every season of effort to produce outward proof. Short-term reactors, by contrast, often find themselves pulled by whatever feels most immediate. This does not imply carelessness. Many are diligent, responsible, hard-working, yet without a stabilizing horizon. Their financial life can begin to resemble a sequence of responses rather than a coherent trajectory. Opportunities are evaluated primarily for their near-term effect. Commitments are accepted without always tracing their future implications. Relief today can unintentionally become restriction tomorrow. The difference between these orientations becomes especially visible during moments of uncertainty. When conditions shift economically, professionally, personally, those anchored to a longer timeline tend to ask, "How does this fit into the broader arc of my life?" Reactors, understandably focused on immediacy, may feel compelled to adjust quickly, sometimes at the expense of continuity. Continuity is one of the quiet advantages of long-term thinking. It allows momentum to persist even when circumstances fluctuate. Rather than reinventing direction repeatedly, the builder makes measured course corrections while remaining broadly aligned. It is important to recognize that long-term thinking does not require perfect foresight. No one sees the future with precision. What it requires is orientation, a willingness to let tomorrow participate in today's decisions. And this orientation can begin at any moment. You do not need ideal conditions to widen your horizon. Often it starts with a pause, a deliberate breath between impulse and action, followed by a simple inquiry, "Will my future self thank me for this?" Future selves are easy to neglect because they are silent. They do not compete loudly with present desires. Yet every thoughtful decision is, in essence, a quiet act of care extended forward in time. Over years, these acts accumulate into something deeply reassuring, a life less governed by urgency, less vulnerable to disruption, more capable of absorbing the unexpected. There is also a psychological spaciousness that accompanies long-term orientation. When every outcome need not materialize immediately, pressure softens, progress can unfold at a sustainable rhythm. Setbacks, while never welcome, appear less catastrophic when viewed within a broader timeline. Perhaps most liberating is the realization that wealth itself is less a destination than a byproduct emerging naturally from years of aligned decisions. Yet as horizons expand and structures strengthen, an important question begins to surface. What, ultimately, are we building toward? For if wealth is pursued without reflection, it can easily be mistaken for a purely numerical pursuit, an endless escalation rather than a meaningful expansion. To build wisely, one must eventually ask, what does wealth truly mean for my life? Let us turn there now to redefine wealth, not merely as accumulation, but as something far more human. Chapter 10. Redefining Wealth. When the word wealth is spoken, the mind often moves first toward numbers, balances, assets, income levels, visible markers of financial arrival. Numbers matter, of course. They provide structure, measurement, and capability. They allow plans to become actionable and futures to be prepared. But if wealth is understood only numerically, something essential can be missed. Because beyond a certain threshold, what people are truly seeking is rarely the number itself. It is what the number makes possible. Pause for a moment and consider what financial stability quietly provides. The ability to face the unexpected without immediate fear. The freedom to make decisions without constant financial strain shaping the outcome. The space to choose thoughtfully rather than react urgently. In this light, wealth begins to reveal itself less as a display and more as a form of protection. Protection from fragility. Protection from forced choices. protection from living perpetually at the edge of one's resources. Perhaps the most overlooked dimension of wealth is breathing room. Breathing room is psychological as much as financial. It is the sensation that life is not one unforeseen event away from disruption. It allows the nervous system to soften, to operate from consideration rather than vigilance. When breathing room is present, the future no longer feels like something to brace against. It becomes something you are gradually prepared to meet. Another quiet gift of wealth is time autonomy. Not necessarily the absence of responsibility. Meaningful lives often include many, but the growing ability to decide how your time is directed, to step back when necessary, to lean in when it matters, to support those you care about without destabilizing your own foundation. Time autonomy is rarely dramatic, yet its absence is deeply felt. Many people discover that what they long for is not perpetual leisure, but the dignity of choice. There is also a form of wealth expressed through emotional steadiness. When financial life is structurally supported, decisions carry less hidden tension. Conversations about money soften. Sleep grows less interrupted by quiet calculations about what might go wrong. This steadiness does not eliminate life's uncertainties. No structure can. But it changes how those uncertainties are experienced. Instead of looming threats, they become challenges met from prepared ground. Importantly, redefining wealth does not diminish ambition. It refines it. Accumulation without reflection can become endless, each milestone quickly replaced by another. Satisfaction perpetually deferred. But when wealth is understood as a means rather than an end, progress gains direction. The question shifts from, "How much can I gather?" to something more clarifying. What kind of life am I enabling? For some, the answer may involve flexibility, the ability to pivot when new callings emerge. For others, it may center on stability, ensuring that loved ones are supported regardless of circumstance. Still others may seek the capacity to contribute beyond themselves, extending opportunity outward. There is no universal definition, but there is immense power in defining it consciously. Because once wealth has meaning, decisions acquire coherence, sacrifices feel less arbitrary, patience becomes easier to sustain. You are no longer building toward an abstract horizon. You are building toward a life you have thoughtfully envisioned. It is also worth acknowledging that wealth and simplicity are not adversaries. Often, as financial clarity deepens, so too does discernment. People begin to recognize which expenditures genuinely enrich their lives and which merely occupy space. This recognition can be quietly liberating. Complexity recedes, attention returns to what endures, and gradually, wealth begins to feel less like something you chase and more like something you are cultivating. Of course, this cultivation is rarely flawless. There will be periods of acceleration and periods of pause, moments of certainty and moments of recalibration. Yet when guided by a clear understanding of what wealth is meant to support, even adjustments feel purposeful rather than disorienting. Perhaps the most reassuring realization is this: wealth is not reserved for a fortunate minority. At its core, it is the natural byproduct of aligned behavior sustained over time. Decisions that strengthen rather than strain, habits that prepare rather than postpone, perspectives that widen rather than compress the future. And while the path is rarely identical from one life to another, the underlying principles remain remarkably consistent, which brings us gently to the final reflection of this journey. For understanding these patterns is only the beginning. The deeper invitation is this: to step forward, not merely informed, but intentional. To see yourself not as someone hoping for financial stability, but as someone capable of building it. Becoming a builder. There comes a quiet moment in the life of every thoughtful person, a moment that rarely announces itself, yet changes the direction of everything that follows. It is the moment one stops asking, "Will my financial life somehow improve?" and begins asking, "What am I deliberately building?" This shift may appear small from the outside, but internally, it marks the transition from passive hope to conscious authorship. Throughout this journey, we have explored ideas that often remain unspoken. The psychology beneath behavior, the influence of environment, the quiet strength of patience, the stabilizing force of emotional discipline, and the expanding clarity that comes from defining wealth with intention. Taken individually, each insight offers guidance. Taken together, they form something more enduring: a builder's orientation. A builder understands that wealth is rarely the result of dramatic turning points. More often, it emerges from hundreds of modest decisions, choices so ordinary in the moment that their significance is easy to overlook. A thoughtful pause before committing, a habit sustained beyond initial enthusiasm, an expense declined in favor of future ease, a plan maintained when distraction invites deviation. None of these actions announce themselves as life-changing, yet over time, they accumulate into a structure capable of supporting not only your present, but the many seasons still ahead. It is important to remember that becoming a builder does not require perfection. No financial life unfolds without missteps. There will be decisions you would revisit if given the chance, moments shaped by incomplete information, seasons where progress feels slower than hoped. These experiences do not disqualify you. They educate you. For builders are not defined by uninterrupted success, but by their willingness to continue constructing, adjusting the blueprint when necessary, strengthening what can be reinforced, and refusing to abandon the horizon simply because the path contains complexity. Another quiet truth worth carrying forward is this: there is no universal timeline you are required to follow. Some begin early, others begin thoughtfully, many begin again. What matters is not the moment you started, but the direction you choose once awareness arrives. Because direction, once claimed, possesses extraordinary power. Even small adjustments, when consistently aligned, can alter the landscape of a lifetime. You may not notice the shift immediately. Most meaningful construction is initially invisible, but one day, often without a dramatic marker, you may look around and sense something different. A growing stability beneath your choices, a widening margin within your life, a calmer relationship with the future, and you will realize that what once felt distant has been forming quietly through your own steady participation. As you move forward from here, resist the cultural pull toward urgency. You are not required to build loudly. You are not required to prove progress on anyone else's timetable. Durability rarely seeks attention. Allow your life to strengthen at a pace that favors endurance over impression. Protect your margin. Honor your future. Let patience remain an ally. And perhaps most importantly, extend yourself a measure of grace along the way. For financial growth, like personal growth, is not merely a technical process, it is deeply human. It asks for learning, recalibration, and the humility to evolve as new understanding emerges. Each thoughtful decision you make is in essence a quiet act of care for the person you are becoming. And that future version of you, less burdened by urgency, more supported by structure, is being shaped even now by choices that may appear small, but are anything but insignificant. So wherever you stand today, whether at the beginning of your financial awareness, in the midst of rebuilding, or steadily refining an already stable path, know this: wealth is not reserved for the extraordinary. It is built by those willing to see clearly, choose deliberately, and continue patiently. From this moment forward, you need not think of yourself as someone waiting for financial security to arrive. You may think of yourself as what you are becoming: a builder, and builders, by their very nature, create futures stronger than the past. Thank you for spending this time with Audiobook Lib. If these ideas brought you clarity, consider subscribing and return whenever you are ready to think deeper about your life, your finances, and your future.